This conference will now be recorded.
Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Christy Franzak, and welcome to this very special Council for Exceptional Children and co-sponsored Division for Early Childhood webinar. We titled this Stress Detectives and Safe Harbors, Helping Children Feel Secure. So let me just do a quick thing to tell you a little bit about what we mean by being a stress detective. And so if you're walking around while you're listening to this webinar, I'll describe a few things to you. If you're watching it, you can look on your slide and you can see several different things that are from what Stuart Shanker refers to as the cognitive domain of stress. So things like having to organize your thoughts, maybe even concentrating, doing difficult math, even if you have some confusion around things or competition or multitasking. These are things that we often talk about as stressors. But what's really interesting is that there are actually 5 domains of stress. And so when we think about being a stress detective, which is going to be this theme that we're going to work through today in the webinar, we really need to broaden our idea of where does stress come from, how does it impact the body, and then what can we do it to support children and students. So Stuart Shanker, who's out of the Merit Center in Canada, talks about 5 domains of stress. So I just mentioned a few in the cognitive domain, but there's also the biological, emotional, social, and prosocial. So just by way of trying to make this really connect to you first, let's look at the prosocial. So everyone at the time of this recording is living through and trying to navigate the pandemic. And so there are these stressors that are called prosocial that are impacting all of us. And stressors, as we'll learn throughout this webinar, can really impact our ability to develop, to learn, to just even stay in a state of, like, we call it the green zone, but just sort of this regulatory state where we can even just think about things. So I'm going to list several prosocial domain stressors, and I want you just to like tick them off in your head, or if you have a piece of paper that you're taking notes on, just make a note, like a little hash mark. Each time I note a stressor, I want you to say, is that impacting me right now? Now, remember, there are 5 domains. We're going to list several from the prosocial domain that are really impacting us right now. And I want you just to get a sense, not to overwhelm you, but to really get a sense of how many of these stressors are at play in my own life, not to mention the life of the children and students that I'm supporting. So how many of you feel that you're being drawn to express empathy or sympathy? How many of you are dealing with world events? I know this is quite, rhetorical at some question, but let's go through them. How many of you are experiencing or processing other people's strong emotions? How many of you are having to wait your turn, wait till something opens, wait till the number of people can be allowed into an establishment, wait until you can go back into your classroom? How many of you are being impacted by social media, or being called upon to give a gift, or seeing the injustice that this pandemic is really illuminating, the lack of equity that we have in so many facets of our globe, and especially here in the United States? Are you having to share your space, perhaps, with more humans on a more frequent basis than you have before? Do you maybe have a sick friend, whether it's as serious as the virus or just everyday things that we get as humans? Do you have a sad friend? Are you a sad friend, right? So I've only listed 10 of like 15, 20, 30 pro-social domain stressors. And you probably are going to look down at your piece of paper, or you're going to feel your shoulders up in your ears at this point going, oh my gosh, Christy, all of these things are impacting me right now. And so what we want to learn and dig into in this webinar is not just to be aware of these stressors and let them overwhelm us, but to really think about, how can I play a stress detective, recognize and then reduce them? You'll notice that some of these we have more control over than others. So that's part of our building our tools, and our capacity is to say, which stressors do I have a say over? So just very quickly, if we haven't met before, I'm Christy. I'm actually a past president of the Division for Early Childhood. I'll tell you a little bit about my background and how it became that I really got interested in thinking about what are the impact of stressors on early development and learning, and then certainly what role do they play right now as we're thinking about extended school closure, and or many of us are thinking about when will childcare and educational systems open again. Some have remained open. What are the impact that those are having on early care and educational workers? What are we thinking about in terms of how do you do social distancing with very young children? How do you do social distancing with children who have neurodiversity? So we're going to unpack all of that. Sometimes people get a little bit confused where I am. I get a little bit confused where I am in the world, but I grew up in the state of Idaho, and I live in the state of Ohio. And so back, a few months ago when I traveled all the time, I often went to the state of Iowa. And those sound an awful lot alike to many people. Idaho, Iowa, Ohio. And so I found this amazing t-shirt in Des Moines, and it said Idaho, Ohio. It's so big you would have thought it was 3 different states, but it's really one, the great potato corn tire state. But as we know, any of us that live in those 3 amazing states, they're really distinct and different. But it gets a little bit confusing for people to go, where is Christy? But I am home based here in Ohio, and that really my journey, though, in working with children who have neurodiversity and have diverse abilities began in Idaho when I was working with preschoolers with diverse abilities. And then I went to school at the University of Oregon, and I started working with many children there in the Eugene, Oregon area. And these are just a few pictures from way, way back, early in my work as an early interventionist and early childhood special education teacher. And I dug them up and I put them into my introduction because they just bring so much joy to my heart in remembering these very early children who taught me so much about how disability is really a human difference. This is really about diversity. Julie Costin of Inclusive Schooling always helps us remember that disability, as we often talk about it, is something that society creates the barriers for people, and that these differences are just things about being human. And today we're going to talk a lot about differences in our window of tolerance to these stressors. So I'm pulling upon many of these young children who are now young adults, or maybe not so young adults, that really taught me about how to be a stress detective and how to really support their learning. For many years, I was faculty at Kent State University. That's what brought me here to Ohio from Oregon. And for 16 years, I was faculty preparing others to work with young children from birth to grade 3 to serve children and their families that are neurodiverse. And then in 2016, I left the university and I started my own company that was really focusing on what we call the revolution. And I borrowed this from someone from Michigan, an amazing woman, Grace Lee Boggs, who put parentheses around the R. And her emphasis was to say that we all need to seek an evolution. We need to all change. And so I will often refer to you all as revolutionaries. And we're really thinking about how do we revolutionize early care and education. And really one of the things we're learning through this pandemic is how do we revolutionize educational systems, whether they be early childhood or pre-K through 12th grade. So we're really going to think broadly today about whether we are a parent, if we're a district administrator, a therapist, a teacher. We're all in this to think about how do we revolutionize our approach to supporting other humans. And I'm going to end the webinar thinking really about you as a leader and how you can be a stress detective as you support those amazing revolutionaries. Again, whether they're families, teachers, therapists, we really want to think about how do we as leaders support adults and be a stress detective for them as well. So this is our framework for this whole webinar, this idea of being a stress detective. And we've introduced this big idea that there's tons of stressors. But what do we do about it? What does a stress detective do on a day-to-day basis? And so we're going to pull from attachment science. And in particular, we're going to pull from the work of Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson. Now, I'm going to make reference to a lot of people, a lot of podcasts and blogs and downloads, and you might have liked those infographics that you saw earlier in the webinar. We will have links to all of those on the CEC website. So the place where you found this webinar is where you'll find links to all of the things that I'm mentioning. So there'll be handouts to my key PowerPoint handouts. There'll be downloads to infographics. There'll be downloads to podcasts and blogs. So don't worry if you're trying to catch all of these names and all of these words and acronyms, just kind of sit back or go for a walk and really just think about what it means to be a stress detective and create a safe harbor. And so our framework is going to be attachment science. And Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson talk about this across their work, but they talk about it in particular in a book called The Power of Showing Up. And I was able to have Dan Siegel on my podcast a few months ago, and we talked about these 4 S's. He was one of my guests, and the other was Barb Avila from Synergy Autism Center. And Barb and I are actually doing a Q&A after this webinar that is sponsored by the DEC group to really give you a chance to ask questions about things that I'm talking about, because this is a recorded webinar and we don't have a chance for that get back and forth, that sort of, I got a question, what does that mean? What does it look like if I have a student that has autism, or if I have a 3-year-old that has Down syndrome, or. So we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into the 4 S's with my colleague Barb Avila, who is an expert in all things neurodiverse. And so this framework of safe, seen, soothed, and secure is just going to be our home base so that we know, this is what a stress detective does. A stress detective is always making sure that they are thinking about, are children safe? Do they feel seen? Are they soothed? And am I creating a secure attachment? Again, towards the end of this webinar, we're going to talk about what does the look like when you're a leader, whether you are a teacher leader, whether you are a school psychologist who's a leader of an IEP team, or if you're a building administrator, maybe you're a dad and you're the leader of your 2 young children. We're going to think broadly about how leaders also need to think about the framework of being safe, seen, soothed, and forming secure attachments with their staff, with their families, and with other adults that they're serving. So we'll get back to that. But let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the brain when these stressors are occurring. So I am not a neuroscientist, I always like to say, but I like to play one when I'm doing webinars. This is just sort of my understanding of a lot of amazing work and researchers. Stuart Schenker will be on my podcast coming up, and I can't wait because he's brilliant, and I struggle mightily to keep up with just the amazing things he knows about what's going on in the brain and the body. But I hope to do justice to it, to give you just a little in so that you feel confident in being a stress detective and creating safe harbors. So if you're not looking at the screen and you just want to do something kind of experiential and think about the brain, I want you to hold one of your hands up, just like you're going to do a virtual high five with me. And this is called the model of the brain. And this comes from Dan Siegel. And so what he does is he takes your hand, you can just take your hand, and you just extend your 4 fingers and you stick your thumb out. So you've got like a stretched out hand. And then I want you to put your thumb and fold it in to the palm of your hand. We're going to talk about that being a limbic break. And then you're going to take your 4 fingers and you're going to fold it over your thumb. So your thumb sort of wrapped into the palm of your hand with your 4 fingers wrapped over it. This is a model roughly of what our brain looks like. And so let's open it back up and label the different parts of it. And then we'll talk about what stressors are doing to this poor little brain of ours, and then what we can do to help others do something with those stressors and feel safe. So when the brain feels safe, it is able to learn, develop, and really be in this really strong relationship with other people. When the brain is overstressed, it will flip its lid. So I want you to take your four fingers and just open them back up. That's flipping your lid. And then take your thumb off and out, kind of like you're just going to stretch it out. And that's taking the brake off of your limbic area. And so what happens is information comes in through the brainstem, which is there at the base of your palm. Kind of, if you've ever read your palm, it's kind of there by your lifeline. And that's kind of that base of your skull where you have your brainstem. And all information comes in through our brainstem on its way up through our fingertips. And we don't want it to slow down. We want it to come in and keep on going. But sometimes if the alarm has gone off and we don't feel safe, we will shift into what you've heard before of fight or flight, freeze, or faint. So that's hyperarousal, fight or flight, hypoarousal, freeze or faint. My colleague, Shelley Moore, also from Canada, said the other day that during the pandemic, she's created a fifth F, and that is flop on your bed in a state of depression. And so you might freeze or faint, or you might flop, right? So we want information, sensory input, stimuli to come in through that brain stem, up through the limbic regions, which is all those big fancy words like the hypothalamus and the amygdala. Now, if the brake is on, which is a good thing, then we don't overreact to that stimulus. We just let it go through the limbic region and out through the neocortex, or the upstairs brain, and out to the fingertips, which is our prefrontal cortex. In human development, this brain of ours is super, super underdeveloped at birth. And so we are born with this brain that's got so much capacity, but it takes years and years and years and years to develop. And not only just the passage of time, but it takes safety, being seen, having other people soothe our nervous system, and being in secure relationships that allow the brain to become what we call differentiated and linked, really balanced. So what happens, again, the information comes up through that palm of your hand, through your fingertips, and out through the prefrontal cortex. When your lid has flipped, you are unable to access all that beautiful stuff that takes place upstairs in your brain: perspective taking, empathy, recall, compassion, problem solving. So all these amazing things that we need to do as humans to make a good choice, to learn, to develop, is offline. So a stress detective is trying to notice when somebody's going to flip their lid, and or when the lid is flipped, how to get it set back down, and so that people of any age feel ready to learn and are in a place that they can develop through co-regulation. So what are some common stressors, especially for young children? These are stressors when you're really young. Why I pull that aside is because your brain is so immature. So when we say immature, it takes about 25 years to develop. And that means, again, through good relationships and good nutrition and good places that keep you in a safe harbor. So when we're thinking about very underdeveloped brains, very immature brains, we want to be really cautious that these stressors don't become too much, because it's going to impact their development going forward. I just finished a 3-day virtual summit with an amazing group of providers in Idaho, and we talked a lot about how sometimes we have a lot of colleagues that may be much older than 25 and really lack in skills in professionalism, or may be really resistant to change, or may struggle to implement recommended practices. And so we had to talk a lot about how they may have developed over the years, 25, 30, 40, 50 years of kind of out of co-regulation, not learning how to self-regulate and not learning how and what to do about these stressors. So we want to think about how can we as stress detectives limit limit the impact these stresses are having on the developing brain. So you saw a couple on your screen here that when children feel confused or the demands of the situation are a lot, they may have trouble with sensory motor. So that's things like knowing where their body is in space. Anything that crosses when their body has to cross midline, kind of that, where's my left side, where's my right side, even balance and things that kind of go from the ability for your midline from the top to the bottom. When I have to do anything that requires that sort of sensory motor skills, it could be overwhelming. You're like, well, Christy, that's a lot of things from like eating to playing with toys to running around. And it's like, yeah, there are these stressors that aren't just things like trauma. I don't mean just like, as if that's to minimize it, but we often think of stress or ACEs or things that are traumatic, we recognize, or at least we're increasingly recognizing the impact on the brain and the body. But what about just moving through space? That's a stressor. Directions and corrections are stressors. Experiencing intense emotions ourselves, exposure to violence. You might also be thinking, oh my gosh, I think that a lot of the kids that I'm serving are experiencing this in a heightened way with extended school closures. So we need to remember that as schools open up, as childcare it gets more expanded more, even though it's been open, it's back to more and more families being served in group care. We need to think about how are we ensuring that we're being a stress detective as children and families re-enter. And we want to be thinking about children's wholeness, not just, oh my gosh, we've missed so many opportunities to work on language and literacy and math and science. But we have to remember that as a stress detective, children may be exposed to lots of violence or have trouble sleeping. I know I, for one, am having an incredible time sleeping. So that is going to impact my ability to keep my lid on. And I may rely more heavily on stress detectives in my life to help me feel safe, seen, soothed, and secure. A few more that are very common in group care or for young children, again, who are just learning and developing. Anything that is a large group activity. So we often talk about center time or morning meeting, anytime where we have group starts and group stops, especially if you think of kindergarten and first grade, that almost the entire day is spent in groups. The whole group is doing the literacy block. The whole group is doing the math part. The whole group is going outside. The whole group is going to the library. Now, that may change a little bit as we think about the need for continued social distancing, but whenever we are in a group, it's harder for the single caregiver to notice our needs and be a really good stress detective. So again, poor nutrition, poor hydration, sensory overload, unpredictable situations, and unresponsive adults. These are things that cause children to feel a great amount of stress, means that their body is going to more readily send off an limbic alarm that says, I don't think you're safe. And if they can't get some input from their environment, which includes the physical and the social environment, then they're going to go all the way down to that basement brain and they're going to go into fight or flight, freeze or faint. We call that hyper aroused, hypo aroused, and sometimes we attribute different colors to that. But right now, you just want to know that this has a huge impact. But the good news is that we as caregivers, whether we're families or grandparents, teachers or therapists, bus drivers, doesn't really matter what our role is. If we are an adult in the life of children and students, we are the key to being able to be the stress detective. And so when we are thinking about being that key, we're trying to make sure that children are safe. So we are protecting children from harm and we're avoiding being the source of threat or fear. We're going to dive deep into what it means to be um, safe, a safe harbor, and not be the source of threat or fear, because you're thinking, well, of course I'm not that person. I'm their educator. I'm their home visitor. I'm their speech therapist. I'm not the source of threat or fear at all. But I want to broaden what we think about what is, to a human, what causes threat or fear. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Then, being the key to children's success, we also see ourselves, that we are thinking about their wholeness. So I see myself and I see the children I serve holistically. I don't just see their reading needs or their science skill needs. I see that all of this is interrelated, mind, body, spirit, that there's this wholeness. I also am responsive and I model calm and an inner peace, so that that interbrain, that mirroring of neurons, that when I am calm, they are calm. And then I create an environment of trust and provide a learning base for self-regulation and empowerment. And so we're really going to focus on these four S's, but we're going to really dive into what it means to create safe harbors, how to ensure that other humans feel safe. And so let's talk a little bit about what do we mean, um, basically from a neuroscience perspective, what do we mean that there is a sense of safety? So there's this broad way of thinking of it, which is that my system, my neurological system, this is going to be like a double negative, registers that there isn't a threat. So it's the absence of fear. But what's so interesting about us as humans is that different things make us feel fearful. So we, as a stress detective, need to be really attuned with other humans so that we understand what makes them feel fear, not just what we know from our own experiences. So certainly the physical environment is safe. There's no threat of harm. And so that's kind of like, of course, Christy, they're able to move around and not hurt themselves. There aren't any people that are going to inflict physical harm. But what else? So this is just sort of this notion of I don't feel frightened, or I don't feel like I have to guard or put my guard up. And some of these things are sort of unconscious. We may not even realize it, but there may be environments that maybe you serve a third grader who feels a little bit unsure during whole group reading time or having to read aloud, and they're going to feel guarded because they don't read very well, and that is going to be a source of fear. So we want to keep those internal alarms, that limbic region, that middle of your palm, we want those alarms not to be going off all the time. Well, there's so many things that we as humans are fearful about. They kind of go, the alarm goes off a lot, but we at least want the alarm to go off and then the prefrontal cortex to go, I hear you, the alarm's not going off, but it's all good. So we want people to know it's okay to be vulnerable. I'm not going to be judged or ridiculed or in some way made fun of. I kind of am okay with going on what's going on. It's predictable. I know what's going to happen. And even if something isn't predictable, I know that somebody here will make sure that I stay safe. And I kind of know what's expected. I know what to do. I know what's happening. How many of you, as things have shifted so quickly in the past few months, haven't known what to expect, what to do, or what's happening? All of us should raise our hand to that question. And as we think about reentry into our educational systems, we don't know what to expect. We're not quite sure what to do, and we don't know what's happening. So we as stress detectives have to be aware of our own alarms going off and making sure that we're not passing that on to the children and of any age that we're serving. And my friend Laura Fish wrote a beautiful blog the other day about helping talk to children about the pandemic, and I'll put that on our landing page where you found this recording as well. It'll be a really helpful resource because she talks about the four S's, and she talks about how do we talk to children about things. And that's going to be part of our responsibility as we think about reentry, is how do we talk about uh, what's going on and how school will look and how school will feel. And then we just need to understand that all humans will have an alarm go off based upon what we say, of course, but also our gestures, our looks, our tone of voice, the pace at which we move, and then the absence of those things. So, the absence of a gesture, the absence of a word, the absence of a look. And so, we need to be thoughtful all the time. And now you can start to say, I can see why having so many kids in a classroom, even pre-academic, pre the virus, pre-pandemic, was difficult, because how can one caregiver be attuned to every single child's limbic alarm going off and then have the ability to change the environment, change what they're doing to make sure that that student feels safe? It's such a tall order. So we really want to be sure that as we think about supporting children through this pandemic, that we're emphasizing, are we creating safety? Okay, so you're probably like, okay, got that, Christy. We know it. They're making us feel worse. You're making my lid flip. So let's talk a little bit about what are some specific strategies? What are things that any of us can do? Again, any of us who are families, home visitors, teachers, therapists, principals, consultants, coaches. I know I've missed a million of y'all, but whatever role we play, we can do these 6 things. And these 6 things will help other humans feel safe. So we're going to talk about it for younger humans. Those will be many of my examples. But towards the end, we'll talk about what does it look like when I do things to create a safe harbor for my staff or for the families that I serve. So for those adults. So let's break it down. I have a whole other webinar and a blog that talks about these 6. So if you feel like you need more, I'm going to reference other things that you can go and learn from that are either a podcast or a webinar or a blog. But I wanted to make sure that in this recording, you at least had 6 things you could put in your pocket or your toolkit, 6 things that you could do immediately. And then no matter what our reentry looks like, or no matter when you're listening to this recording, these would still serve you well. These are sort of like pandemic or no pandemic. These are good things we can do as stress detectives to create a safe harbor, regardless of the age of those we serve. Okay? So the first one is that we slow down and we approach silently. So when children have flipped their lid, when they are struggling to feel safe, one of the things that we can do to help send a signal to that brain that this is good, it's okay, is that we can connect with them. So even if a child is over the top or really hypo aroused. So let's do 2 examples. Let's say a child is screaming and throwing things, and that's really hyper aroused. Or let's say a child is very withdrawn and has sort of gone into their shell and is quite unresponsive. So those are kind of extremes, but it's the hyper and the hypo. Oftentimes, we're told to ignore when a child does something. Now, this is a big topic. So I want you just to know all of a sudden, ooh, what did she just say? We're not supposed to ignore, or we are supposed to ignore. There are different ways of thinking about it. There's an actual strategy called planned ignoring that comes out of a field or a theory or a group of practices that many call behaviorism or applied behavior analysis. And anyone who is a board certified behavior analysis analyst or someone that works in the world of applied behavior analysis, you're going to know a lot more than like 99% of the rest of us. So I have a podcast and a blog that go deep into this topic of planned ignoring. So if you need to make yourself a little note to go deeper and then to have discussions with your behavior intervention team or your behavior therapist or your ABA team, that's great. I'm just going to share from my perspective and from what I see in terms of neuroscience that
Planned ignoring is not a strategy that makes the human feel safe. Okay, so we want to, in those instances where a child is hyper or hypo aroused, we want to go silent, but I don't want people to think that means to ignore. So I sometimes say approach silently. So I still want to connect with that human. I want to avoid ignoring, but in some way, if my job is to let them know that they are safe, I have to in some way connect with them. And so we'll give you lots of links that you can dive deep into this. But if you see somebody's lid is flipped, all you need to think about right now is they need me to connect with them, but not through a lot of talking. And so I don't want to say a lot of things or ask a lot of questions or remind them of the rules right then. So we want to connect, slow down, and do that without a lot of talking. The second thing we can do to help somebody kind of get back into this more balanced or regulated state, this ability to manage energy and tensions, is that we can co-regulate with them. So again, you're going to see some overlap between these 6 strategies. I want you to stay in the moment. Maybe the way that you connect is by empathizing non-verbally. So that might be giving a look of compassion, a look that like, this is rough, versus an angry look or a look that I'm rushing you to stop doing whatever it is you're doing that's flipped my lid now. So we really want to stay present, empathize non-verbally, and avoid forcing or rushing people to be calm. So what does that look like? It means that I'm very responsive and that I'm putting our relationship first and foremost. I'm not worried about reinforcing the bad behavior. I'm not worried about you getting your way. I'm really thinking about, at this moment, you need me to help put the brakes on for you. That limbic alarm has gone off, and you need somebody else that you can trust to put the brake on for you. I need to create a sense of security, and I need to model calm because of that mirroring of neurons. If I'm calm, it sends a signal, even subconsciously, to my child that says, it's okay. I don't have to say anything. I don't have to remind them of anything. I can just try to be calm. So Stuart Schenker would invite us to ask in that moment that the child is throwing something or the child has withdrawn, why and why now? That pause, just asking the question why, keeps our prefrontal cortex engaged. It allows us to put the brakes on our system and then to be able to put the brakes on for the child who's become hyper or hypo-aroused because of stressors. Okay, third strategy to help children feel safe and create a safe harbor is to do what we call a prompting strategy, or others will call it a priming strategy. Again, my friend Laura Fish, the one that wrote the blog about how to talk to children about their fears or anxiety or what's going on during the pandemic. She describes this strategy as allowing children to consider the plan, sorry, allowing children to consider and plan as things unfold. So it's helping children get off of autopilot and invite them to make a decision. This is an invitation to leave that, downstairs brain and come upstairs. So the steps I would take to help children use this strategy is I pause. So you see the kind of overlap between all 3 of these strategies so far. I'm not going to rush. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to jump right in. I notice what the child is trying to communicate or the emotion that they're trying to process. And then I make a statement that invites discovery. For example, I might say to the child, I wonder what you need. I wonder what might happen if we do this. Or I might say to them, I wonder what you were trying to do. This is actually causing that child's brain to think about why. Why am I doing this? Why am I feeling like this? what could I do differently? So that's called the priming or prompting strategy. The fourth of the 6 strategies to help others feel safe and create a safe harbor is to really do what we call a reframe. And this again comes from Stuart Schenker. This is this reframe misbehavior as stress behavior. So instead of thinking the child is just doing this to get their way, the child's trying to get my attention, the child just wants to escape, we want to really look at this as a complex human being who is struggling to process big emotions and deal with all the stressors that are impacting their nervous system all at once. So we want to start to see that this is a need, not a want, and that my job as a stress detective in creating a safe harbor is to address that need and to avoid anything that would do overwhelm. So again, if I do a lot of directions, corrections, or ignoring, that will overwhelm the child even more. So we want to reframe that what we're seeing is stress behavior, not misbehavior. The fifth strategy that a stress detective uses is this idea of throwing the child a lifeline. Now, again, for any of you who have a strong tradition around planned ignoring, this is going to be a little bit of a disconnect. So you might want to, again, dive deeper into some of the work of neuroscientists like Dan Siegel or Stuart Schenker that talk about what the research shows about what's going on in humans when they have stressors, when they their bodies flip their lids and you see what might appear to be attention seeking or trying to avoid something, where the complexity comes in, and that our job is to offer a lifeline. So this is not about being permissive, and this is not about coddling or allowing children to do things that are harmful to themselves or to other. This is all about creating a safe harbor. So I talk a lot about in this moment when I notice that you have flipped your lid and you can't put your own brakes on, that I need to change my role. So I'm no longer your mom, I'm no longer your teacher, but I'm rather your boat captain. So I talk a lot about throwing lifelines. I'm now a boat captain, and a boat captain, when they see somebody go overboard, is not as worried about teaching them to swim right that moment. They're not really worried about reminding them of the rules that we follow when we're on the boat. They're not even really that worried that, wow, if I rescue them, they're going to keep diving overboard because they've, manipulated the situation and I've reinforced it, and they're just going to keep swimming when they're not supposed to. Nope. Most of the time, a boat captain would be like, I've got somebody overboard. My job right now is to get them back on the boat. When they're back into the safety of my boat, then I can worry about teaching them the rules or teaching them what to do and how to process that big emotion in a way that isn't kicking, screaming, withdrawing, or going overboard. So that's what we talk about in terms of offering lifelines. And we have a whole blog that unpacks an infographic that gives you examples of lifelines. But every single child that you're supporting or serving will need different lifelines at different times. So you need a big, big stack of lifelines. And then you just need to, as a stress detective, know when to offer, how to create a safe harbor by offering lifelines, and then knowing which lifeline works for which student. And then our sixth and final stress detective strategy that helps create a safe harbor is that we repair and we restore. So when a child has flipped their lid, when they aren't able to put their own brakes on, how do we help them process that big emotion, apply a coping strategy so that they can actually establish that balance in their brain and body once again? And then how can we do this in a way that we don't just keep revisiting the same problem? We don't want to create a stronger neural pathway that when I feel this big, strong emotion, I hit somebody, or I feel this big, strong emotion, so I withdraw. What we want to do is create a different neural pathway. And so we want to remember and kind of come full circle that at this moment, we are going to find a way to restore the balance. So those stressors were really taxing. They took their toll on this poor little body. And so all of those biological, emotional, social stressors have taken their toll. So what can we do to repair and restore balance to the system so that a child knows that they are safe and then can return to learning? And so one of the things that I'll include for you is this adapted tree of contemplative practices. This tree has all kinds of ways that we as humans can kind of connect inwardly and outwardly, but in a way that helps us restore our energy to a level that allows us to keep our lids back on. And so this might be going for a walk. This might be sharing a story. This might be doing something that is for the care of others, write, dance, be quiet. So there's all kinds of things. And so this tree of contemplative practices I offer for you as the humans supporting other tiny humans. So to make sure that you, when your lid has been flipped, because it's hard working with children that have gone into hyper or hypoarousal. So how do we make sure that we're restoring ourselves as well? We're all living through a pandemic. What are we doing for our teachers and our therapists and our providers so that they feel able to be the safe harbor for the children and students that they serve? So what I'd like to do is through this last little bit of the webinar is really talk about our job in supporting adults who then support children and students. So we want to think about, how do I create a safe harbor? So one way I do that is that I know if the adult who I'm supporting or supervising or serving, that they are ready to learn. That same hand model of the brain applies across the lifespan. So whether I'm 50 or 15 or 5, my brain works the same way. The good thing about the older brain is that it has had many opportunities to be ready to learn. That said, if I am really resistant or really reactionary or lack what you might call professionalism, that might mean that even though I'm older, I am not really ready to learn. I sort of live in a state of hyper or hypoarousal, and I live there for 25, 35, 45 years. That means that neural pathway is a really deep and strong habit. So you might have adults who are not ready to learn a new practice. This pandemic has asked all of us to really dig deep and find different ways to educate and support children who are neurodiverse. That's taken its toll. So what are we doing to make sure that as we re-enter, that adults know that they are ready to learn different strategies to be able to support the students that they're serving? Again, we as leaders, whatever that might look like, need to be stress detectives, and that we need to be making sure that we are reducing stressors for those adults as well. We want to apply the 4 S's, including creating a safe harbor. So we want to make sure that our schools, our policies, our emails are things that are ensuring those adults that we serve, that they are safe, seen, soothed, and we have secure relationships with them. We also want to do what we call extend the green zone for them. I'm going to do later today, when I'm recording this webinar, a Facebook Live broadcast on how do we do this for adults? How do we really extend their ability to learn and adapt and be responsive? How do we create a safe harbor for them? So if you're curious about going a little bit deeper about raising the emotional intelligence, which is going to be absolutely necessary of all the adults who are serving children who are neurodiverse, look for that link as well on the CEC landing page where you found this webinar. Okay, a little bit more. So when we think about being the key or being a stress detective and offering safety for the adults, it's the exact same thing as when we work with younger students or people. So there's an infographic that you can download of what you see on your slide. There's two sides to it. One is what are the synonyms for what it means to feel safe? And we talked about that for children. And so I've unpacked it again. This is some work that I did with an amazing team in Boulder Valley that we were just trying to understand, what does this word safe mean? And so we've given you a list of ways to remember what it means for a human to feel safe. Then on the right-hand side, we've got several practical strategies about how you can create a safe harbor for the adults in your life. And I'm just going to walk you through a couple so that you can really see them in a practical way. So if you want the adults in your life to feel safe so that their lid does not flip and they can stay in that prefrontal cortex and do perspective taking, problem solving, empathy, compassion, comprehension, recall, our job as leaders is to validate versus fix. So if we see resistance, if we see someone overwhelmed by a big emotion, we oftentimes really want to fix that for them. Sometimes it's uncomfortable and we just want the big emotion to be over with. So we as leaders need to remember that we have to validate versus trying to fix. I'm showing you sort of this either or this sort of binary way of looking at being a stress detective. But I want you to think about this as really a gray area, that it's not just I validate or I fix. Really, sometimes we do have to fix and sometimes we have to validate. But at first, I want to kind of disrupt your autopilot, which is to fix. And I want you to think instead, I validate. And then we can start looking for the both and, that messy middle. So instead of doing more, I'd like you to actually do less, whether that is more content, more support, more talking, more communication. I actually think that we need to do less. We really need to think about slowing down instead of trying to create more, or certainly to recreate schools that weren't working in the past and do them quickly so we can go back to what wasn't working. We really need to slow down, dive deep, think about what will work and how we can create schools that are safe harbors for all children. We want to think about everyone's needs and see that as a need that we can address versus that they want something. They want my attention. They want predictability. They want to return to normal. Well, in fact, all of us need that. We need to know that we're going to be okay. We need to know that things will resume in some sort of way that we can be humans together in relationships. So our job as leaders is to reframe, just like we would reframe for children, and see the adult behind the behavior and think about what do they need. We want to really create space versus trying to have the answer. So many of us as leaders are looked to, what is the answer? I got an email the other day saying, what is your take on reopening childcares? And, should we be doing it? And I immediately flipped my lid because that is such a big question. And my heart breaks as I think about all the answers and all of the fears and all of the complexities of that question. So sometimes I just have to create a little bit of space before I try to give that answer. And then I have to maybe ask questions instead of give answers. So in the end, what I'm trying to do is create calm. I want to be calm. I want to be the safe harbor for my staff and for my families. I don't want to get stuck in our old ways, old meaning 2, 3 months ago, of really wanting compliance, of really wanting to create educational systems that were built upon fear and standardization and compliance. I really want to think about connections and compassion and calm. And so that as a leader, that I am a boat captain and I am inviting families and children and staff into a safe harbor. So that, in a whole big nutshell, is how we are stress detectives across the lifespan for our own families, for our friends, our colleagues, and certainly for our children who are neurodiverse. How do we make sure that we don't create greater inequity by rushing to recreate educational systems that weren't working for so many children because we didn't spend enough time thinking about being a stress detective? We didn't spend enough time really being attuned to each child in our care and thinking about how can I validate, do less, slow down, address their needs, create space, and be the calm. So I'm going to close this webinar with this beautiful poem. If you've listened to other webinars I've done or been on a webinar with me lately, you've seen this poem by Lynn Unger. And this was shared with me by an amazing DEC member, Janice Fialka, and she really helped soothe my nervous system. She does that many times for me. And she shared this poem. And so I'm one of those little kids who had a lot of anxiety about reading out loud in my educational history. And so I'm going to read out loud to y'all, but it's something that is not easy for me. You're like, well, you just got done talking for a full hour. How hard can it be? There's just a difference between just talking and reading, but it's a beautiful poem, and I hope I do it justice. And then I'll close with showing you how we can stay connected and just wishing you the very best in being able to create a safe harbor for those that you care so much about. So this is a poem by Lynn Unger, and it's called Breathe. Breathe, said the wind. How can I breathe at a time like this, when the air is full of the smoke of burning tires, burning lives? Just breathe, the wind insisted. Easy for you to say if the weight of injustice is not wrapped around your throat, cutting off all air. I need you to breathe. I need you to breathe. Don't tell me to be calm when there are so many reasons to be angry, so much cause for despair. I didn't say to be calm, said the wind. I said to breathe. We're going to need a lot of air to make this hurricane together. So I appreciate each and every one of you. I appreciate each and every one of you making an effort to become a stress detective, to create safe harbors for the children that you love, and recognizing that children who are neurodiverse are just part of this human fabric of diversity that we experience together. And so I would love to stay connected. Again, we're going to share with you a ton of podcasts and blogs and links to people that I mentioned during this webinar, other thought leaders, other teachers that I learn from every day. And you can follow me on social media, sort of depending on which one you like the most. I'm generally on Facebook every day promoting the revolution, and that's Christy PF when you see me on Facebook. Same thing on Instagram and on Twitter. So again, I wish each of you the very best as we re-enter and we reimagine and we continue to revolutionize early care and education for all students.